The silence in my dining room was deafening as 23 pairs of eyes stared at the official document I'd just placed next to the Christmas ham. The red ribbon I'd tied around the eviction notice matched the holiday decorations perfectly, though the shocked expressions around my table suggested my guests weren't appreciating my attention to detail. "What is this supposed to be?" Diane Walsh demanded, her manicured fingers hovering over the legal papers as if they might bite her. The woman who had waltzed into my home 3 months ago without so much as a phone call was now holding a 30-day notice to vacate, complete with legal references and my official letterhead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you. It's exactly what it looks like, Diane, I replied, my voice steady as I carved another slice of ham. Your eviction notice. Merry Christmas. My husband Kevin's fork clattered against his plate, the sound echoing through the stunned silence. His sister Melissa had gone pale, while his brother Tyler was frantically texting under the table, probably alerting other family members to the drama unfolding in real time. But I felt nothing except a profound sense of calm washing over me as I watched 3 months of careful planning come to fruition. You see, when someone underestimates a real estate attorney who specializes in tenant rights and property law, they tend to forget that I know exactly how to protect what's mine. And after 93 days of having my boundaries trampled, my marriage tested, and my own home turned into someone else's kingdom, I'd decided it was time to remind everyone exactly whose name was on the deed. The look of absolute shock on Diane's face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent documenting her behavior, every carefully timed photograph, every recorded conversation that would hold up in court if necessary. She'd played her hand thinking, I was too polite, too accommodating, too desperate to keep the peace to ever push back. She was wrong. Now let me take you back to where this all began, because the woman sitting at my Christmas table in complete disbelief wasn't the same person who'd opened her front door to find Diane Walsh standing there with 3 suitcases and an entitled smile. My name is Natalie Rodriguez, and 3 years ago, I thought I'd found my perfect match in Kevin Walsh. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Denver where I was reviewing property contracts, and he was working on a marketing presentation for his firm. He struck up a conversation about the legal documents spread across my table, genuinely curious about my work rather than intimidated by it. Most men I'd dated seemed threatened by my success as a partner at Denver Property Law Group. But Kevin appeared impressed. Our courtship was refreshingly normal. He respected my career, supported my long hours during challenging cases, and never once suggested I should tone down my ambition. When he proposed 18 months later in the mountains outside Boulder, I said yes without hesitation. I'd finally found someone who saw my strength as an asset rather than a threat. The wedding was intimate, held at a vineyard in Palisade with just close family and friends. Kevin's parents, Robert and Diane Walsh, were polite during the planning process, though I noticed Diane's tendency to offer unsolicited opinions about everything from my choice of flowers to the guest list size. She seemed particularly concerned that we weren't having a larger celebration, mentioning several times how important appearances were in Kevin's industry. People judge you by the company you keep and the events you host, she'd said while reviewing our modest reception plans. Kevin's career depends on making the right impressions. I should have paid more attention to that comment, but I was too focused on starting my marriage to dissect every piece of advice from my new mother-in-law. Kevin assured me his mother meant well, that she just wanted our special day to be perfect. I chose to believe him because I was in love and optimistic about our future together. The first year of marriage was blissful. Kevin and I settled into my Cherry Creek townhouse, a property I'd purchased 2 years before we met. I'd specifically chosen the 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home for its location near downtown and its potential as a long-term investment. The extra bedrooms served as my home office and a guest room, and the open-concept living area was perfect for the dinner parties I occasionally hosted for colleagues and clients. Kevin integrated seamlessly into my established routine. He appreciated the modern kitchen where I experimented with weekend cooking projects, enjoyed the privacy of our master suite with its mountain views, and never complained about the legal documents that sometimes spread across our dining table during complex cases. We talked about eventually buying a larger place together, maybe something with a yard for the children we hope to have someday, but there was no rush. My townhouse was comfortable, paid for, and perfectly suited to our current needs. Diane visited occasionally during that first year, usually for birthday dinners or holiday celebrations. She was always polite, though I noticed her subtle critiques of my decorating choices, my cooking, and my tendency to work late into the evening. She'd make comments about how career women needed to prioritize differently once they were married, how important it was to create a welcoming home environment for their husbands. "Kevin works so hard at the office," she'd say while examining my minimalist living room decor. "He needs a space that feels warm and nurturing when he comes home. Maybe some softer colors, more personal touches." I'd smile and nod, making mental notes to ignore her suggestions later. My home reflected my personality perfectly: clean lines, quality furnishings, and a sophisticated color palette that I'd carefully curated over time. Kevin had never complained about the aesthetic, and I wasn't about to redecorate my space to suit someone else's vision of domestic bliss. The cracks in my peaceful existence began showing during our second year of marriage, when Kevin's marketing firm started experiencing financial difficulties. Several major clients had ended their contracts, and rumors of potential layoffs created stress throughout the company. Kevin began working longer hours, taking on additional responsibilities, and worrying constantly about job security. I supported him through this difficult period, encouraging him to update his resume and network with contacts at other firms, while reassuring him that my income could sustain us if necessary. As a partner at a successful law firm specializing in Denver's booming real estate market, I earned significantly more than Kevin did in marketing. This had never been an issue between us, but I noticed his parents seemed uncomfortable with the financial dynamic. "It must be challenging for Kevin, having a wife who out-earns him," Robert mentioned during one particularly awkward dinner conversation. "Men need to feel like providers, like they're contributing meaningfully to the household." I'd bitten my tongue, choosing not to point out that Kevin contributed plenty through his emotional support, household responsibilities, and partnership in our marriage. Financial contribution wasn't the only measure of worth in a relationship, but I sensed that explaining this concept to Kevin's parents would fall on deaf ears. The real trouble began in late August when Diane called Kevin in tears, explaining that their house had suffered significant water damage from a burst pipe in their master bathroom. The insurance company was covering the repairs, she explained, but the work would take several weeks and they needed somewhere to stay temporarily. "We could get a hotel?" she'd told Kevin over speakerphone while I listened from the kitchen. "But it would be so expensive, and you know how your father's back problems flare up in unfamiliar beds. I just thought maybe we could stay in your guest room for a few days while we figure out other arrangements." Kevin had looked at me questioningly, and I'd nodded, despite the knot forming in my stomach. They were family, they were in a difficult situation, and helping them seemed like the right thing to do. I'd assumed a few days meant exactly that, maybe a week at most while they arranged temporary housing or expedited their repairs. "Of course you can stay here," I'd told Diane directly, taking the phone from Kevin. "The guest room has its own bathroom, and you're welcome to use the kitchen and living areas. We'll make it work." The gratitude in Diane's voice should have been my first warning sign. She'd thanked me profusely, going on about what a wonderful daughter-in-law I was and how lucky Kevin was to have found such a generous wife. In retrospect, her excessive appreciation felt performative, like she was laying groundwork for something bigger than a temporary visit. They arrived on September 1st with enough luggage for a month-long vacation. I'd prepared the guest room carefully, clearing out my exercise equipment and adding fresh flowers and quality linens to make them comfortable. I'd also stocked the refrigerator with foods I knew they enjoyed and cleared space in the bathroom for their toiletries. Diane toured my home with the critical eye of someone evaluating a hotel, commenting on everything from the thread count of the guest towels to the water pressure in the shower. She seemed satisfied with the accommodations, though she mentioned that the guest bed was smaller than she was used to, and the room faced east, which meant morning sunlight might disturb Robert's sleep schedule. "We'll make do," she'd said with a martyred sigh that made me feel guilty for not offering them my master bedroom instead. The first week went smoothly enough. Diane and Robert kept to themselves mostly, though I noticed Diane rearranging items in my kitchen to suit her preferences, and Robert commandeering the television remote during his preferred viewing hours. These were minor inconveniences, the kind of adjustments any household makes when accommodating guests, and I told myself their stay would be brief enough that flexibility was more important than establishing boundaries. Kevin seemed genuinely grateful for my accommodation of his parents, helping with meals and trying to ensure everyone felt comfortable sharing the space. His efforts to maintain harmony were sweet, though I noticed he deferred to his mother's preferences even when they conflicted with our usual routines. "Mom's used to eating dinner earlier than we do," he'd explain when Diane started cooking at 4:30, expecting the rest of us to adjust our schedules accordingly. "And she likes to watch the news while she eats, so maybe we could have dinner in the living room tonight?" I'd agreed to these small changes because I wanted to be accommodating, but I also noticed that Kevin asked me to adjust rather than asking his mother to adapt to our existing household rhythms. This pattern would become increasingly problematic as the days turned into weeks. By the end of September, I started asking about the progress on their house repairs. Diane's answers were vague and increasingly dramatic. First, the contractors had discovered additional damage that required more extensive work. Then, the insurance company was being difficult about covering certain repairs. Later, she mentioned that they were considering upgrading some features while the house was already torn apart, which would extend the timeline significantly. "These things always take longer than expected," she'd say with a helpless shrug. "You know how contractors are." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They promised 2 weeks and deliver 2 months. I'd suggested they might be more comfortable in a furnished apartment or extended stay hotel while waiting for their repairs to be completed. After all, living in someone else's space, even family, had to be stressful for them too. Wouldn't they prefer their own privacy and independence? Diane's response revealed the first glimpse of her true intentions. "Oh, honey, that would be so expensive. And honestly, we're enjoying spending time with you and Kevin. It's been years since we've had real quality time together as a family. Besides, you have all this space, and it's not like we're any trouble. We keep to ourselves, help with cooking and cleaning, and Robert's been handling some of those little maintenance tasks around the house that Kevin never has time for." She wasn't wrong about Robert's helpfulness. He'd fixed a loose cabinet door, adjusted the garage door opener, and replaced several burned-out light bulbs throughout the house. But her comment about spending quality time together struck me as odd, since they'd lived in Denver for Kevin's entire adult life and had plenty of opportunities for family bonding that didn't require moving into our home. More concerning was her casual dismissal of my suggestion about alternative accommodations, as if my preference for privacy in my own home was unreasonable. The phrase, "you have all this space," particularly bothered me because it implied that unused space in my home was somehow available for indefinite occupation by others. October brought more significant changes to our household dynamic. Diane began treating my home like her own, rearranging furniture to suit her preferences, replacing items she considered inadequate, and establishing routines that assumed her permanent residence. She bought new kitchen towels because mine weren't absorbent enough, relocated my living room lamps because the lighting was insufficient for Robert's evening reading, and replaced my bathroom soap with brands that were gentler on mature skin. When I came home from work to find she'd moved my home office supplies to make room for Robert's crossword puzzle books and newspaper collection, I realized we needed to have a conversation about boundaries and expectations. "Diane," I'd said, carefully, finding her in the kitchen preparing what had become her nightly elaborate dinner preparation. "I appreciate you making yourself at home here, but I need my office space to remain functional for work purposes. Could we find somewhere else for Robert's reading materials?" Her response was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as reasonable explanation. "Oh, of course, dear. I just thought since you mostly work at your office downtown, it seemed wasteful to have all that space sitting empty when Robert needs somewhere comfortable to do his puzzles. You know how important mental stimulation is for seniors. But if you need the space occasionally, I'm sure we can work something out." Notice how she'd reframed my request to reclaim my own office as an occasional need, while positioning Robert's hobby as a legitimate claim to my space. She'd also implied that my office was wasteful when not in active use, suggesting that I was being unreasonable in wanting to maintain control over rooms in my own home. This conversation revealed Diane's strategy more clearly than I'd understood before. She wasn't simply overstaying a temporary welcome due to delayed house repairs. She was systematically establishing herself as a permanent resident of my home, using incremental changes and emotional manipulation to make her presence seem both natural and necessary. The realization should have prompted immediate action, a clear conversation about timelines and expectations, but I made the mistake that many conflict-avoidant people make when dealing with manipulative personalities. I convinced myself that direct confrontation would create unnecessary drama, that the situation would resolve itself naturally once their house repairs were completed, and that maintaining family harmony was more important than asserting my preferences about my own living space. This decision to avoid confrontation in the moment would cost me months of peace, strain my marriage, and ultimately require far more dramatic action than a simple conversation would have entailed. But sometimes we need to learn lessons the hard way, and Diane Walsh was about to become my most expensive teacher. By November, Diane had transformed my carefully curated home into something unrecognizable. What started as small adjustments had evolved into a complete takeover that left me feeling like a guest in my own space. She'd installed blackout curtains in the living room because the natural light was too harsh for Robert's sensitive eyes, replaced my modern dining chairs with cushioned versions she'd ordered online for better back support, and somehow convinced Kevin that we needed a larger coffee maker to accommodate everyone's morning routine. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I discovered she'd given away my expensive ergonomic desk chair to charity because it looked too masculine for the guest room that had apparently become Robert's permanent office space. In its place sat a floral-patterned armchair that matched the new throw pillows she'd scattered throughout my living room. "I thought you'd appreciate the upgrade," Diane explained when I asked about my missing chair. "That old thing was so cold and corporate-looking. This creates a much warmer atmosphere, don't you think? Besides, Robert needs proper support for his back problems, and your chair was perfect for his height." I stood there holding my laptop bag, still in my work clothes, staring at the floral monstrosity that had replaced a piece of furniture I'd carefully selected for both comfort and aesthetics. The chair represented something much larger than a simple household change. It was evidence that Diane no longer considered my preferences relevant in my own home. "That chair cost $1,200, I said quietly. "It was specifically designed for long hours of computer work. I need it for when I work from home." Diane waved dismissively at my concern. "Oh, honey, you can work just fine from the couch or the kitchen table. You don't need all that fancy equipment for the little bit of home paperwork you do. This way, Robert can have proper seating for his important activities, and the room looks so much more welcoming." The casual dismissal of my professional needs in favor of Robert's crossword puzzles crystallized everything wrong with our living arrangement. My expensive, carefully chosen office furniture was deemed unnecessary, while his hobby required accommodation and respect. My work was characterized as little bit of paperwork, while his retirement activities were deemed important, enough to commandeer my space. Kevin's response when I raised the issue later that evening revealed how completely his loyalties had shifted during his parents' extended stay. "Come on, Nat, it's just furniture," he said, not looking up from his phone where he was scrolling through sports highlights. "Mom's trying to make the place more comfortable for everyone. You can get another chair later if you really need one." The phrase, "just furniture," applied to my $1,200 ergonomic chair, while his mother's comfort preferences had become household law, told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in the hierarchy of my own home. Kevin's willingness to dismiss my legitimate professional needs while prioritizing his mother's decorating whims showed me exactly how my marriage dynamics had changed since his parents moved in. "It's not about the chair, Kevin," I replied, sitting on the edge of our bed where he was sprawled with his phone. "It's about the fact that your mother is making major changes to our home without consulting me. She's giving away my belongings, rearranging everything to suit her preferences, and you're acting like my concerns aren't valid." Kevin finally looked up from his screen, but his expression suggested annoyance rather than understanding. "My parents are going through a difficult time right now. Their house is torn apart, they're living out of suitcases, and they're trying to make the best of a bad situation. Can't you be a little more flexible?" The word flexible had become Kevin's standard response to any complaint I raised about his parents' behavior. When Diane started using my expensive skincare products because the hotel toiletries were too harsh, Kevin asked me to be flexible. When Robert began parking in my designated spot because it was closer to the front door, Kevin suggested flexibility. When Diane invited her sister over for weekly coffee dates in my living room without asking permission, Kevin recommended a flexible attitude. Flexibility, I was learning, only applied to my willingness to accommodate his family. No one expected Kevin to be flexible about his mother's feelings. No one asked Diane to be flexible about her comfort preferences. The burden of adaptation fell entirely on me, and Kevin had convinced himself this was reasonable because I was the one with the most resources to share. The financial aspect of their extended stay was becoming increasingly problematic as well. While Diane occasionally bought groceries, she purchased expensive organic brands and specialty items that tripled our monthly food budget. She'd upgraded our cable package to include premium movie channels, increased our heating costs by keeping the house significantly warmer than Kevin and I preferred, and somehow our water bill had doubled since their arrival. When I mentioned these increased expenses to Kevin, suggesting that his parents contribute to household costs during their extended stay, he looked genuinely shocked by my request. "They're family, Nat. We don't charge family for helping them during emergencies." The word emergency struck me as increasingly inaccurate for a situation that had stretched into its third month with no clear end date. When I asked Kevin for an update on his parents' house repairs, his answers became as vague as his mother's had been. "These things take time," he'd say with a shrug. "You know how contractors are. Mom says they're making progress, but there have been some complications." I decided to investigate these complications myself, using my professional resources to research the public records associated with Robert and Diane's address. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about their living situation and their reasons for staying in my home. According to county records, Robert and Diane Walsh had sold their house in early August, nearly a month before they'd moved in with us. The property had closed escrow 3 weeks before Diane's tearful phone call about burst pipes and water damage. There had been no insurance claim filed for water damage at their address. There had been no contractors hired for repairs. The entire story about temporary displacement due to home damage had been a fabrication designed to manipulate us into providing free housing while they figured out their next living arrangement. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. For 3 months, I'd been accommodating, flexible, and understanding about what I believed was a temporary emergency situation. I'd allowed my home to be transformed, my routines disrupted, and my marriage strained because I thought I was helping family members through a difficult time. Instead, I'd been providing free room and board to people who had sold their house and decided to take advantage of their son's wife's generosity rather than find their own housing solution. The implications were staggering. Diane and Robert weren't temporarily displaced homeowners waiting for repairs. They were people who had chosen to sell their property and move in with us without ever discussing their plans or asking for our consent. Kevin either knew about this deception and had participated in lying to me, or his parents had manipulated him as thoroughly as they'd manipulated me. I needed to determine which scenario was true before deciding how to proceed. That evening, I approached Kevin with the information I'd discovered, giving him the opportunity to explain the discrepancy between his parents' story and the public records I'd found. "Kevin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I sat across from him at our kitchen table, the county records printed out between us. "Did you know that your parents sold their house before they moved in? Here?" The expression that crossed Kevin's face told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. Guilt, panic, and resignation flashed across his features in rapid succession. He'd known about the deception from the beginning. "Nat, I can explain," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "So you knew. You knew they sold their house, and you let me believe for 3 months that this was a temporary emergency situation. You watched me accommodate them, spend money on their comfort and stress about our household changes, all while knowing they had lied about their circumstances." Kevin's shoulders slumped as the weight of his deception became undeniable. They were in a difficult financial situation. The house sale barely covered their debts, and they didn't have anywhere else to go. Mom was embarrassed about their financial problems, so she thought it would be easier to say it was temporary displacement rather than admitting they needed long-term help. The explanation revealed layers of dishonesty I hadn't even considered. Not only had they lied about their housing situation, but they were apparently in serious financial trouble that made them unable to afford their own living expenses. Kevin had known all of this and had chosen to commit me to an open-ended financial and housing arrangement without my knowledge or consent. "How long have you known they needed long-term housing?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady considering the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Since before they moved in," Kevin admitted quietly. "They asked if they could stay here while they figured out their next steps. I said yes because they're my parents and they needed help. I thought you'd understand if I explained it the right way." The phrase "explained it the right way" was particularly infuriating, because it revealed Kevin's belief that manipulation and deception were acceptable tools for managing my reactions to decisions that affected my life. He hadn't trusted me with the truth because he'd assumed I wouldn't be generous enough to help his parents if I understood the real scope of what they were asking. So, instead of trusting me with the truth and asking for my support in helping your parents through a financial crisis, you chose to lie to me and trick me into an arrangement I never agreed to, I summarized, my legal training helping me cut through the emotional manipulation to identify the core issues. Kevin's face crumpled as he realized how indefensible his behavior sounded when stated clearly. "I was scared you'd say no if you knew how serious their situation was. You work so hard, and your home is so important to you. I didn't want to burden you with their problems." The irony of his statement was breathtaking. He'd been so concerned about burdening me with his parents' problems that he'd instead chosen to burden me with months of deception, household disruption, and financial strain without my knowledge or consent. His approach had created exactly the kind of burden he'd claimed to want to avoid, while also destroying my trust in his honesty and judgment. "Kevin, do you understand that what you've done is fraud?" I asked, my professional expertise finally asserting itself in our personal crisis. "You've obtained housing and financial support through false pretenses. In my professional life, I help people evict tenants who lie about their circumstances to secure housing arrangements." The word evict seemed to strike Kevin like a physical blow. "Nat, please don't talk like that. These are my parents. This is our family. We can work this out." But I was no longer thinking like Kevin's accommodating wife. I was thinking like the real estate attorney I'd trained to become, the professional, who knew exactly how to protect property owners from people who took advantage of their generosity. The legal framework for addressing this situation was crystal clear in my mind, even if the emotional landscape remained complicated. "Here's what's going to happen," I said with the calm authority I used in depositions. "Your parents have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements. I'll put this in writing so there's no confusion about the timeline or expectations. During these 30 days, they'll contribute $3,000 monthly toward household expenses, which is below market rate for the space and utilities they're using." Kevin's eyes widened at the sum I'd named, but I'd calculated it carefully, based on comparable rental costs in our neighborhood. "Nat, they can't afford $3,000 a month. That's why they needed to sell their house." "Then they need to find housing they can afford," I replied without sympathy. "Their financial problems don't entitle them to free housing at my expense, especially when the arrangement was obtained through deception." The conversation that followed revealed the extent to which Kevin had been manipulated by his parents' financial desperation. They'd been living beyond their means for years, using credit cards and home equity loans to maintain a lifestyle their retirement income couldn't support. The house sale had barely covered their accumulated debts, leaving them with minimal savings and no clear plan for sustainable housing. Diane had convinced Kevin that asking me directly for help would be too humiliating, that I might judge them for their financial mismanagement or refuse to assist family members in need. She'd suggested that framing their situation as temporary displacement would be less emotionally challenging for everyone involved, giving them time to figure out their options without feeling like charity cases. Kevin had accepted this reasoning because it allowed him to help his parents without confronting the difficult conversations that honest communication would have required. He'd chosen the path of least immediate resistance, not considering the long-term consequences of building our housing arrangement on a foundation of lies. The most infuriating aspect of Kevin's explanation was his continued focus on his parents' feelings and comfort rather than the impact of their deception on our marriage. He seemed genuinely surprised that I was angry about being lied to, as if the results of their manipulation somehow justified the dishonest methods they'd used to achieve them. "But everything worked out fine," he said, apparently confused by my outrage. "You got along well with my parents. They've been helpful around the house, and nobody got hurt by the little white lie about their circumstances." The phrase, little white lie, applied to 3 months of systematic deception about their housing situation, financial status, and future plans, demonstrated how completely Kevin had adopted his parents' perspective on appropriate behavior within relationships. What I considered a fundamental betrayal of trust, he characterized as a minor social courtesy designed to protect everyone's feelings. This conversation forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about my marriage that I'd been avoiding for months. Kevin's loyalty to his parents superseded his commitment to honesty with me. When forced to choose between his family's comfort and our relationship's integrity, he'd chosen his family without hesitation or apparent regret. The realization that my husband considered me less deserving of truth and respect than his parents' comfort was devastating. But it was also clarifying in a way that helped me understand exactly what kind of action this situation required. I spent the next week documenting everything I could about Robert and Diane's actual living situation, financial status, and the timeline of their deception. As a real estate attorney, I understood the importance of thorough documentation when dealing with difficult tenant situations, and I approached this personal crisis with the same methodical preparation I'd use for any complex legal case. The documentation process revealed additional layers of manipulation I hadn't previously recognized. Diane had been telling her friends and extended family that Kevin and I had invited them to move in permanently because we loved having them around and wanted to provide a multi-generational household for future grandchildren. She'd positioned herself as the beloved mother-in-law whose presence was so valued that her son and daughter-in-law had requested her permanent residence. This narrative served multiple purposes for Diane. It protected her pride by avoiding admissions of financial hardship It made her appear wanted and valued rather than desperate and dependent, and it created social pressure that would make asking them to leave seem cruel and unreasonable to outside observers. I also discovered that Robert and Diane had been telling Kevin that I was thriving with their presence, that I seemed happier and more relaxed with help around the house, and that they believed I was grateful for the family connection their residents provided. They'd systematically misrepresented my feelings and reactions to Kevin, making him believe I was content with the arrangement while simultaneously telling me he was grateful for my accommodation of his parents. This triangulated communication pattern had prevented Kevin and me from having honest conversations about the impact of his parents' extended stay on our marriage. Each of us had been operating under false assumptions about the other's feelings, assumptions that were carefully cultivated by people who benefited from our continued misunderstanding. The manipulation was sophisticated and effective, designed to maintain their housing arrangement by preventing the direct communication between Kevin and me that might have resulted in their eviction months earlier. Diane had positioned herself as the helpful interpreter of everyone's feelings, ensuring that conflicts were minimized and her presence remained welcome. Recognizing the extent of their manipulation crystallized my resolve to end this situation decisively. These weren't confused family members who had made poor communication choices during a stressful time. These were calculating individuals who had systematically deceived multiple people to secure free housing and financial support while avoiding accountability for their circumstances. The 30-day timeline I'd given Kevin was more generous than they deserved, but it demonstrated my commitment to handling the situation legally and ethically despite their dishonest behavior. I would document everything, follow proper procedures, and ensure that any future attempts to manipulate or deceive me would be met with swift legal consequences. By December 1st, exactly 3 months after Robert and Diane had moved into my home under false pretenses, I was ready to formalize my eviction notice and reclaim control of my living situation. The Christmas dinner timing wasn't chosen for dramatic effect, though I admit it provided a certain poetic justice that appealed to my sense of irony. The holidays had always been important to Diane, an opportunity to showcase her family hosting skills and create memorable traditions that positioned her as the heart of family celebrations. She'd been planning an elaborate Christmas dinner for weeks, inviting extended family members and talking about how wonderful it would be to host everyone in my spacious home. What she didn't realize was that her Christmas dinner would become the setting for the most memorable holiday tradition she'd ever created, though not in the way she'd intended. Sometimes the most effective lessons are taught through the very circumstances people choose for their own comfort and convenience. The first week of December brought a revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about Robert and Diane's financial situation. While reviewing my credit card statements for tax preparation, I discovered charges I hadn't made, purchases that coincided perfectly with the expensive organic groceries, premium cable upgrades, and household improvements that had appeared throughout their stay. Diane had somehow gained access to my credit card information and had been using it to fund her enhanced lifestyle in my home. The charges were clever, mixed in with legitimate household expenses in amounts that wouldn't immediately trigger fraud alerts. $150 at Whole Foods here, $200 at Target there, $75 for a subscription service I'd never heard of. Individually, each charge seemed plausible as something I might have purchased and forgotten about. Collectively, they represented nearly $4,000 in unauthorized spending over 3 months. The discovery required me to confront an uncomfortable truth about the level of violation I'd been tolerating. This wasn't simply a case of difficult houseguests overstaying their welcome. This was financial theft, identity fraud, and criminal behavior disguised as family emergency assistance. I spent hours that weekend reviewing months of statements, meticulously documenting each unauthorized charge and cross-referencing them with my actual receipts and purchase records. The pattern that emerged was damning and systematic. Diane had been treating my credit cards like her personal shopping account, funding everything from her weekly salon appointments to expensive Christmas gifts for extended family members. The most infuriating discovery was a series of charges to a high-end furniture store that corresponded exactly with the dates when my living room had been mysteriously upgraded with new lamps, throw pillows, and decorative accessories. Diane hadn't simply rearranged my existing furniture to suit her preferences. She'd been purchasing expensive replacements using my money, then positioning these improvements as generous gifts she was providing to enhance my home. When I confronted Kevin with the evidence of his mother's theft, his response revealed just how completely his moral compass had been compromised by months of enabling his parents' manipulative behavior. "Are you sure these charges aren't just mistakes?" he asked, examining the printed statements spread across our kitchen table. "Maybe she used your card accidentally, thinking it was her own. You know how confusing it can be when multiple people are sharing household expenses. The suggestion that nearly $4,000 in unauthorized charges over 3 months could be accidental demonstrated either willful ignorance or deliberate complicity on Kevin's part. My credit cards didn't resemble theirs in color, design, or account information. The charges had been made both online and in person, requiring deliberate use of my account details and security codes. "Kevin, your mother stole my credit card information and committed fraud," I said clearly, using the precise legal terminology that applied to her actions. "This isn't a mistake or confusion about shared expenses. This is criminal behavior that I could prosecute if I chose to involve law enforcement." The mention of criminal prosecution seemed to penetrate Kevin's denial in a way that previous conversations hadn't achieved. His face paled as he realized the potential consequences of his mother's actions extended far beyond family drama into actual legal liability. "Nat, please don't talk about involving the police," he said, his voice taking on the desperate quality I'd heard increasingly often when discussions about his parents arose. "She's elderly, she's been under stress, and involving law enforcement would destroy her reputation in the community. Can't we handle this privately as a family matter?" The phrase "family matter" had become Kevin's standard deflection whenever his parents' behavior crossed clear boundaries of acceptable conduct. When Diane had given away my expensive office chair without permission, it was a family matter requiring understanding rather than consequences. When Robert had damaged my car while using it without asking, it was a family matter that shouldn't involve insurance claims or repair costs. Now, when his mother had committed multiple felonies by stealing my financial information, it was still a family matter that shouldn't involve appropriate legal responses. "Kevin, this stopped being a family matter when your mother started committing crimes," I replied, my patience finally exhausted with his attempts to minimize serious misconduct. "She didn't accidentally use my credit cards. She deliberately accessed my financial information, used it without permission, and concealed her theft by mixing fraudulent charges with legitimate household expenses." I pulled out my phone and showed Kevin the photos I'd taken of my credit cards, which had been left on my dresser the previous evening, but were now carefully repositioned in a slightly different arrangement. "I marked their positions last night with invisible ink that shows up under UV light. Your mother moved these cards sometime between midnight and 6 this morning, which means she's still actively accessing them." The expression on Kevin's face, as he realized the extent of his mother's ongoing criminal behavior, was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and fear. He'd been defending her actions as misunderstandings and accidents, but the evidence of continued deliberate theft was impossible to rationalize or excuse. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice hollow with the recognition that his family's behavior had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed through explanations or apologies. "I want you to understand that your parents aren't confused elderly people making innocent mistakes," I said, sitting across from him with the calm authority that had served me well in difficult legal negotiations. "They're sophisticated con artists who have been systematically defrauding us for months. The fake housing emergency, the unauthorized credit card usage, the manipulation of our communication, all of it has been carefully planned and executed." Kevin's resistance to accepting this characterization of his parents revealed the depth of psychological manipulation they'd achieved over months of careful grooming. Despite overwhelming evidence of deliberate deception and theft, he continued, searching for alternative explanations that would preserve his image of them as loving family members facing difficult circumstances. "Maybe they're just desperate," he suggested weakly. "People do things they wouldn't normally do when they're scared about money and housing. That doesn't make them con artists." The distinction Kevin was trying to maintain between desperation-driven, poor choices and deliberate criminal behavior might have been meaningful if his parents had shown any remorse, offered to make restitution, or acknowledged the harm their actions had caused. Instead, they'd continued their deceptive practices even after being confronted about some of their misconduct. "Kevin, your mother used my credit card this morning to buy groceries after we discussed the unauthorized charges yesterday," I said, showing him the real-time notification I'd received on my phone. This isn't desperation driving poor choices. This is ongoing criminal behavior by someone who believes she's entitled to unlimited access to other people's resources. The evidence of continued theft, even after partial confrontation, seemed to break through Kevin's psychological defenses in a way that previous revelations hadn't achieved. He stared at the notification on my phone, finally understanding that his mother's behavior wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment, but a deliberate pattern of exploitation that would continue indefinitely without serious consequences. I spent the next several days conducting the kind of thorough investigation I'd normally perform for clients facing complex fraud cases. Using my professional resources and legal contacts, I researched Robert and Diane's actual financial situation, credit, history, and recent legal entanglements. What I discovered painted a picture of two people who had been living beyond their means for years, accumulating debt through increasingly sophisticated schemes, and targeting family members as their primary sources of financial support. Robert and Diane Walsh owed approximately $80,000 in credit card debt, had defaulted on 2 previous mortgage agreements, and were facing garnishment proceedings from multiple creditors. Their house sale hadn't covered their accumulated debts, as Kevin had been told. Instead, they'd sold the property to delay bankruptcy proceedings and buy time to find alternative sources of income. Court records revealed that they'd previously stayed with Diane's sister for 6 months under similar false pretenses, claiming temporary displacement while actually using the arrangement to avoid rent payments during their financial crisis. That arrangement had ended when Diane's sister discovered unauthorized charges on her credit cards, leading to a family estrangement that explained why they hadn't approached her for help this time. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Robert and Diane systematically targeted family members with resources, manipulated them into providing housing and financial support through false emergency narratives, then exploited their generosity as extensively as possible before moving on to their next victims. Kevin and I weren't their first targets, and we wouldn't be their last unless someone took decisive action to end their fraudulent behavior. Armed with this information, I realized that simply asking them to leave wouldn't solve the broader problem of their criminal conduct. They would continue targeting other family members, friends, or vulnerable individuals unless they faced serious consequences that made future fraud attempts impossible or inadvisable. The decision to involve law enforcement wasn't motivated by vindictiveness or anger, though I certainly felt both emotions toward people who had violated my trust so completely. It was motivated by my professional responsibility to prevent ongoing criminal behavior, and my personal commitment to ensuring that other potential victims wouldn't suffer the financial and emotional damage that Kevin and I had experienced. I scheduled a consultation with Detective Maria Santos at the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, bringing with me the comprehensive documentation I'd assembled over weeks of investigation. Detective Santos reviewed my evidence with the experienced eye of someone who'd seen similar fraud cases many times before. "This is a textbook example of family-based financial fraud," she explained after reviewing my documentation. "The perpetrators use emotional manipulation and family loyalty to prevent victims from reporting criminal behavior. They're counting on your reluctance to prosecute family members which is why they feel safe continuing their theft even after being confronted. Detective Santos confirmed that Robert and Diane's behavior constituted multiple felonies, including identity theft, credit card fraud, and obtaining housing through false pretenses. The systematic nature of their deception and the involvement of vulnerable elderly victims in their previous schemes elevated the potential charges to levels that could result in significant prison sentences. We've been tracking similar patterns in several other cases, Detective Santos continued. Elderly couples with financial problems targeting younger family members through false emergency narratives. Your case provides some of the best documentation we've seen, which could be crucial for prosecution efforts. The possibility that my situation could help protect other families from similar fraud schemes added another dimension to my decision-making process. Prosecuting Robert and Diane wouldn't just address their theft from Kevin and me. It could prevent them from victimizing others and potentially expose broader patterns of elder financial abuse that law enforcement was investigating. However, Detective Santos also explained the practical challenges of prosecuting family-based fraud cases. Victims often refused to cooperate with investigations once they understood the potential consequences for their relatives. Defense attorneys exploited family relationships to generate sympathy for defendants and minimize criminal penalties. Juries sometimes struggled to view family-based theft as seriously as they would theft between strangers. The strongest cases are those where victims are willing to follow through with prosecution despite family pressure, Detective Santos advised. If you're not prepared to testify against your in-laws in court, potentially sending them to prison, then filing charges might not be the most effective approach. The question of whether I was prepared to see Robert and Diane face criminal penalties for their behavior required serious consideration of my values, priorities, and long-term goals. I'd entered this situation wanting to reclaim my home and restore my marriage to its previous stability. Now I was contemplating actions that could result in my husband's parents spending years in prison and permanently destroying any possibility of family reconciliation. The moral complexity of the decision was compounded by Kevin's increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate alternative solutions that would avoid legal consequences for his parents. He proposed repayment plans, family mediation, and even temporary separation while his parents found housing elsewhere. Anything that might resolve our immediate problems without involving criminal prosecution. "They're old, Nat," Kevin pleaded during one of our increasingly frequent arguments about how to proceed. "Prison would destroy them? Can't we find a way to get our money back and make sure they leave without ruining their lives completely?" Kevin's continued focus on protecting his parents from consequences, rather than acknowledging the full extent of harm they'd caused, revealed how completely our priorities had diverged during this crisis. He was still thinking like their son, desperate to shield them from accountability. I was thinking like their victim, determined to prevent future harm to ourselves and others. The conversation that finally resolved my uncertainty occurred when I overheard Diane on the phone with someone she addressed as Cousin Margaret, apparently recruiting her next housing target using a refined version of the same false emergency narrative she'd used on Kevin and me. "The contractor situation has been a nightmare," Diane was saying, her voice carrying the same tone of helpless frustration she'd used to manipulate us. "We thought we'd be back in our house by now, but you know how these things go. Kevin and Natalie have been wonderful, but we don't want to overstay our welcome. And I remembered you mentioning that you had extra space since Uncle Harold passed." The realization that Diane was actively recruiting her next victim while still residing in my home, still using my credit cards, and still lying about her circumstances eliminated any remaining hesitation about involving law enforcement. She wasn't a confused elderly woman making poor choices under stress. She was a career criminal who viewed family relationships as opportunities for exploitation. I called Detective Santos that afternoon and scheduled a formal interview to provide my statement and evidence for criminal charges. The decision felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, but it was the only response that adequately addressed the scope of criminal behavior I'd uncovered. Kevin's reaction when I informed him of my decision to pursue prosecution was more extreme than I'd anticipated. He accused me of vindictiveness, cruelty, and prioritizing money over family relationships. He threatened to leave me if I proceeded with charges that could send his parents to prison. He even suggested that my professional training had made me too quick to involve legal solutions instead of seeking family-based resolutions. "This is who you really are," Kevin said during our final argument about the prosecution decision. "When things get difficult, you choose legal battles over family loyalty. You'd rather destroy my parents than work together to solve our problems." The accusation that wanting to stop ongoing criminal behavior represented a character flaw rather than appropriate boundary setting revealed how completely Kevin had internalized his parents' victim narrative. In his mind, I was the aggressor for refusing to tolerate theft, fraud, and systematic deception. His parents were the victims for facing consequences of their criminal choices. This conversation forced me to confront the possibility that my marriage might not survive the actions necessary to reclaim my home and financial security. Kevin had chosen his parents' comfort over our relationship's honesty, their criminal behavior over my legitimate rights, and their continued presence over my peace of mind in my own home. The choice between preserving my marriage and protecting myself from ongoing victimization shouldn't have been necessary, but Kevin's unwillingness to support appropriate consequences for his parents' behavior had created exactly that dilemma. I could continue enabling criminal behavior to maintain family harmony, or I could take decisive action that might end my marriage, but would definitely end my victimization. Standing in my kitchen that December evening, looking at the credit card statements documenting months of theft, listening to Kevin defend people who had systematically defrauded us, I realized that some choices make themselves. The woman who had built a successful legal career protecting other people's property rights couldn't rationalize allowing her own rights to be violated indefinitely for the sake of maintaining relationships with people who viewed her only as a resource to be exploited. The eviction notice I'd been preparing as a boundary-setting measure had evolved into something much more comprehensive. Along with the 30-day notice to vacate, I would be serving Robert and Diane with documentation of the criminal charges being filed against them and the evidence that would be presented in court. Christmas dinner would indeed be memorable, but not in any way Diane had anticipated when she'd begun planning her elaborate holiday celebration in my dining room. December 20th arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch. I stood at my kitchen window, watching Robert shovel the walkway with the same methodical precision he brought to all his activities, completely unaware that his industrious helpfulness would be ending in 5 days. Diane was already bustling around the kitchen, preparing her elaborate Christmas menu planning session that had somehow expanded to include 17 family members for dinner on Christmas Day. The irony of watching them settle deeper into their routines while I finalized the legal documents that would upend their comfortable deception wasn't lost on me. They'd grown so confident in their manipulative success that they'd stopped even pretending their stay was temporary. Diane had begun talking about spring gardening plans for my backyard and suggesting renovations that would make the guest bathroom more suitable for permanent residents. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Santos confirming our final evidence review meeting scheduled for December 23rd. The timing was perfect, allowing me to complete the criminal complaint paperwork while ensuring that all documentation would be ready for service alongside the eviction notice on Christmas Day. The coordination required careful planning, but, then again, event planning had always been one of my professional strengths. Kevin had been increasingly distant since our argument about prosecution, spending more time at work and communicating with me primarily through polite but strained conversations about household logistics. His withdrawal might have concerned me more if I hadn't been so focused on the meticulous preparation required to execute my plan effectively. The emotional processing could wait until after I'd reclaimed control of my living situation. The guest list for Diane's Christmas dinner had grown beyond the capacity of my dining room, requiring her to rent additional tables and chairs that would transform my entire first floor into an elaborate dining space. She'd consulted me about these arrangements with the casual assumption that I'd be delighted to host nearly 20 people in my home for an event I'd had no voice in planning. "I've arranged for the rental company to deliver everything on Christmas Eve morning," Diane had announced while reviewing her detailed timeline. "The extra tables will fit perfectly in the living room if we move your furniture temporarily. Kevin's cousin Sarah offered to bring her good china since we'll need place settings for 17, and I've ordered a beautiful centerpiece arrangement that will complement your existing color scheme." The presumption that my home would be available for her entertaining needs, that my furniture could be relocated at will, and that my preferences about holiday hosting were irrelevant had crystallized my resolve about the timing of my legal response. If Diane wanted to use Christmas dinner as a showcase for her hostessing abilities in my space, it seemed only appropriate that the occasion also serve as her introduction to the consequences of her criminal behavior. I'd spent weeks perfecting the documentation that would accompany my eviction notice, ensuring that every legal requirement was met and every piece of evidence was properly authenticated for potential court proceedings. The package I'd prepared included the formal 30-day notice to vacate, copies of all fraudulent credit card charges with supporting documentation, screenshots of the false housing emergency communications, and a detailed timeline of their deceptive practices over the past 4 months. The criminal complaint I'd filed with Detective Santos would be served simultaneously with the eviction paperwork, creating a comprehensive legal response that addressed both the housing violation and the financial crimes. The coordination between civil and criminal proceedings would make it impossible for Robert and Diane to manipulate individual aspects of their situation without addressing the full scope of their misconduct. My attorney, Patricia Chen, had reviewed all documentation and confirmed that my legal strategy was both sound and comprehensive. She'd also prepared protective measures that would prevent Robert and Diane from attempting to damage my property, steal additional items, or retaliate against me during their departure process. Given their history of financial fraud and property manipulation, Patricia had advised during our final consultation, we need to assume they might attempt to damage your home or steal valuable items before leaving. The restraining order components of your filing will allow immediate law enforcement intervention if they engage in any retaliatory behavior. The restraining order provision was something I'd added after discovering that Robert and Diane had attempted similar retaliation against Diane's sister when she'd confronted them about their credit card theft. According to court records from that situation, they'd damaged appliances, stolen electronics, and attempted to claim ownership of improvements they'd made to her property using her money. Kevin remained unaware of the comprehensive nature of my legal preparations, though his behavior suggested he suspected something significant was developing. He'd begun asking careful questions about my work schedule, my meetings with unspecified colleagues, and my increased focus on financial paperwork. His attempts at casual inquiry felt more like reconnaissance than genuine interest in my professional activities. "You've been working a lot of late hours lately," he'd mentioned while we passed each other in our hallway, both of us maintaining the polite distance that had characterized our interactions since our argument about prosecution. "Big case coming up?" The question contained an undercurrent of anxiety that suggested Kevin's intuition was warning him about developments he couldn't quite identify. His growing nervousness was probably influenced by his parents' increasing confidence about their permanent residency, creating a tension between his guilt about their deception and his fear of consequences for their behavior. I'd responded to his inquiry with vague references to year-end legal work and tax preparation, technically truthful answers that didn't reveal the specific nature of my activities. The partial honesty felt appropriate given Kevin's participation in months of deliberate deception about his parents' circumstances and ongoing criminal behavior. December 23rd brought an unexpected complication when Diane announced that she'd invited 2 additional families to Christmas dinner, bringing the total guest count to 23 people. The expansion of her guest list without consulting me demonstrated how completely she'd assumed ownership of holiday planning in my home, but it also provided additional witnesses for the legal document service I'd planned. "I hope you don't mind the extra guests," Diane said while reviewing her updated seating arrangements spread across my kitchen table. The Morrison family just returned from visiting relatives, and Patricia's daughter is home from college, so it seemed cruel to exclude them from our celebration. Family gatherings are so much more meaningful when everyone feels included. The emphasis on inclusion and family feelings in the context of people who had systematically excluded me from major decisions about my own home was particularly galling, but I simply nodded and continued reviewing my own paperwork while she planned her elaborate event. By Christmas evening, the concepts of inclusion and family loyalty would have entirely different meanings for everyone gathered around my dining tables. My final meeting with Detective Santos confirmed that all criminal complaint documentation was properly filed and ready for service. The charges included multiple counts of identity theft, credit card fraud, obtaining housing through false pretenses, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The evidence package we'd assembled was comprehensive enough to support prosecution, even if Robert and Diane attempted to claim confusion, desperation, or misunderstanding as defenses. The systematic nature of their deception and the involvement of multiple victims makes this a strong case for prosecution, Detective Santos confirmed while reviewing our final evidence compilation. The service of criminal charges alongside your eviction notice will demonstrate the serious legal consequences of their behavior and may discourage them from attempting similar schemes with other family members. The criminal charges would also create a public record that future potential victims could discover through background checks, making it much more difficult for Robert and Diane to successfully implement their false emergency housing schemes with other relatives or acquaintances. The prosecution would serve broader protective purposes beyond simply addressing their theft from Kevin and me. Christmas Eve morning arrived with Diane in full hostess mode, directing the rental delivery team with the confidence of someone orchestrating an event in her own home. She'd transformed my living and dining areas into an elegant, entertaining space that showcased her decorating abilities and attention to detail. The irony that her final performance as lady of the house would also serve as the setting for her legal reckoning added a theatrical element to the situation that appealed to my sense of justice. Kevin spent the morning helping his father with last-minute preparations while avoiding direct conversation with me about the family gathering or our ongoing relationship tensions. His discomfort was increasingly obvious, but I attributed it to general anxiety about family dynamics rather than specific awareness of my legal preparations. The rental tables were arranged to create one continuous dining space stretching from my formal dining room through the living room to the bay window area near the kitchen. Diane had covered them with elegant linens and created elaborate place settings using a combination of borrowed china, rented glassware, and silver serving pieces that transformed my casual home into something resembling a small restaurant's private dining room. "Everything looks absolutely beautiful," I told Diane honestly while surveying her decorating accomplishments. "You've created something really special here." My compliment was genuine because her event planning skills were impressive, and I could appreciate her aesthetic achievements separate from my feelings about her criminal behavior and boundary violations. The dinner she'd organized would indeed be memorable for everyone involved, though not for the reasons she anticipated. The guest list Diane had compiled represented a comprehensive cross-section of extended family relationships, including Kevin's siblings and their spouses, several cousins with their children, Kevin's elderly aunt and uncle, and the family friends she'd added at the last minute. The gathering would provide maximum witnesses for the legal document service while ensuring that news of Robert and Diane's legal troubles would spread quickly throughout their social network. I'd timed the document service to occur during the main course of dinner, after everyone had arrived and settled into the celebratory atmosphere, but before the meal concluded and people began leaving. The timing would ensure maximum impact while providing enough remaining dinner time for the full implications of the legal documents to be understood and discussed. The red ribbon I'd tied around the eviction notice was a deliberate choice that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The bright color would draw immediate attention to the document when I placed it on the table, while the ribbon created a gift-like presentation that emphasized the irony of receiving legal consequences disguised as a holiday surprise. Christmas. Morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of pristine mountain visibility that made Denver's location seem like a postcard advertisement for Colorado living. I dressed carefully in a burgundy wool dress that projected professional authority while remaining appropriate for holiday entertaining. The outfit choice was deliberate, designed to reinforce my position as the homeowner and legal professional who was taking control of an untenable situation. Diane had been awake since dawn, preparing food and finalizing table arrangements with the energy of someone hosting the social event of the season. Her excitement about showcasing her entertaining skills in my beautifully appointed home was touching in a way that might have generated guilt if I hadn't discovered her months of systematic financial theft and deception. "This is going to be such a wonderful celebration," Diane said while arranging the final floral centerpieces. "There's nothing more important than family coming together, especially during the holidays. These are the moments that create lasting memories." Her comment about lasting memories was more accurate than she realized, though the specific memories being created would be quite different from her expectations. The Christmas dinner of 2023 would indeed become a story that family members would discuss for years to come, though not as a heartwarming tale of holiday togetherness. Guests began arriving at 2 o'clock, filling my home with the cheerful noise of family reunions and holiday greetings. Kevin's siblings and their families brought children who immediately gravitated toward the Christmas tree and the promise of gift opening after dinner. The elderly relatives settled into comfortable chairs with glasses of wine, while the younger adults clustered in the kitchen helping with final food preparations. The atmosphere was genuinely warm and festive, filled with the kind of intergenerational family bonding that Norman Rockwell paintings are designed to capture. Diane moved through the gathering with the confidence of a beloved matriarch hosting a cherished family tradition, accepting compliments on her decorating and menu planning, with gracious acknowledgement of her efforts. Kevin's behavior throughout the afternoon suggested increasing anxiety about something he couldn't quite identify. He was attentive to his parents and helpful with hosting duties, but I noticed him watching me with a wariness that indicated his intuition was picking up signals his conscious mind hadn't yet processed. "You seem really calm today," he commented while we stood near the kitchen island, both of us observing the family gathering with polite smiles. "I thought you might be stressed about hosting this many people." His observation was accurate because I did feel remarkably calm despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. The months of careful planning and legal preparation had created a sense of confident control that was almost meditative in its certainty. I knew exactly what was going to happen, when it would happen, and what the consequences would be for everyone involved. "I'm looking forward to a memorable evening," I replied truthfully, accepting a glass of wine from Kevin's cousin while maintaining eye contact with my husband. Some occasions deserve special recognition. The ambiguity in my response seemed to increase Kevin's discomfort, but he was distracted by his father's request for help carving the turkey before he could pursue the conversation further. The timing worked perfectly because it moved him away from me just as I needed to excuse myself for final preparation of the legal documents I'd be serving during dinner. The eviction notice and criminal complaint paperwork were waiting in my home office, professionally printed on legal letterhead, and organized in presentation folders that emphasized their official nature. I'd included explanatory cover letters that summarized the key points for family members who might not understand the legal terminology or implications of the various charges. The criminal complaint detailed 14 separate counts of fraud and theft, with each charge supported by specific evidence including dates, amounts, and documentary proof of deliberate deception. The civil eviction notice referenced Colorado landlord-tenant law and included a comprehensive timeline of lease violations, property damage, and unauthorized modifications to my home. Together, the documents created a legal response that addressed every aspect of Robert and Diane's misconduct while providing clear consequences and expectations for their departure. The comprehensive nature of my legal strategy would make it impossible for them to argue that they didn't understand the seriousness of their situation or the requirements for resolving it. At 5:30, Diane announced that dinner was ready and began directing everyone toward their assigned seats at the elaborately arranged tables. The seating chart she'd created placed Robert and herself at the head of the main table, with family members arranged according to a hierarchy that positioned them as the honored hosts of the celebration. Kevin and I were seated together midway down the table, close enough to the center of activity to participate in conversations, but far enough from the head positions to reinforce Robert and Diane's assumed authority over the gathering. The seating arrangement would work perfectly for my purposes, because it placed me in a central location with clear sight lines to all the guests when I stood to make my announcement. The meal began with the kind of warm family atmosphere that holiday gatherings are designed to create. Multiple conversations flowed around the tables. Children shared stories about school and friends, and adults caught up on career developments and family news. Diane presided over the dinner with visible satisfaction, clearly enjoying her role as the gracious hostess who had brought everyone together for a memorable celebration. The irony that her pride in hosting abilities was about to be permanently associated with one of the most dramatic family confrontations in Walsh family history wasn't lost on me, as I watched her accept compliments on the beautiful table settings and delicious food preparation. Sometimes the most effective lessons are delivered in the settings people choose for their own comfort and validation. As the main course plates were being cleared and people began settling back in their chairs with satisfied expressions, I stood and moved toward the head of the table where Robert and Diane were seated. The movement drew attention from several family members, who probably assumed I was going to offer a toast or express gratitude for the wonderful meal they'd prepared. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the legal documents I'd prepared, each one wrapped with its distinctive red ribbon that matched the holiday decorations scattered throughout the room. The contrast between the festive presentation and the serious legal content created exactly the kind of memorable moment that would ensure this Christmas dinner became legendary in family storytelling. Before we move on to dessert, I announced in the clear, professional voice I used for important legal presentations, I have some documents that need to be served to Robert and Diane Walsh. The silence that followed my announcement was so complete. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 23 family members sat frozen in their chairs, forks suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses paused mid-sip, children's chatter cut off as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire gathering. Diane's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as she processed what I'd just said. Her hand trembled as she reached for the ribbon-wrapped document I'd placed directly in front of her dinner plate, the red bow creating a mockingly festive contrast against the formal legal letterhead visible through the presentation folder. "What is this supposed to mean?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the patriarch of family gatherings. "Some kind of joke?" "It's exactly what I said," I replied calmly, remaining standing at the head of the table where everyone could see and hear me clearly. "Legal documents that need to be formally served to both of you. The ribbons are just for presentation since we're celebrating Christmas." Kevin's sister Melissa was the first to break the stunned silence. "Natalie, what are you talking about? What kind of legal documents?" I gestured toward the folders in front of Robert and Diane, who were both staring at them as if they contained explosive devices. "A 30-day eviction notice and criminal complaint documentation for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and obtaining housing through false pretenses." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, their implications slowly penetrating the shocked minds of family members who had gathered to celebrate Christmas dinner and were instead witnessing the complete destruction of their understanding of recent family dynamics. Diane's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "Criminal complaint? 14 separate felony charges, actually. I said with the same professional tone I used when explaining complex legal situations to clients. Each one supported by extensive documentation of deliberate fraud and theft spanning the past 4 months. Kevin's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he stood abruptly, his face drained of color. "Natalie, what the hell are you doing?" The profanity at Christmas dinner in front of elderly relatives and young children would normally have drawn sharp rebukes from multiple family members, but everyone was too shocked by the larger drama unfolding to worry about language violations. "I'm serving legal notice to 2 people who have been systematically defrauding us since September," I replied, meeting Kevin's horrified gaze with steady eye contact. "Your parents sold their house before moving in here, lied about emergency circumstances, and have been using my credit cards without permission to fund their lifestyle while living in my home rent-free." The gasps from around the table were audible now, as family members began processing the implications of what I'd revealed. Kevin's Aunt Margaret actually dropped her wine glass, the sound of crystal shattering against china creating a punctuation mark for the destruction of family illusions happening in real time. "That's not true," Diane said, but her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes were darting around the table seeking support from family members who were now staring at her with dawning suspicion rather than sympathy. I reached into my other jacket pocket and withdrew a thick folder of supporting documentation. "I have bank records showing the sale of your house on August 15th, 3 weeks before you claimed to have water damage. I have credit card statements documenting $4,000 in unauthorized charges. I have recorded phone conversations where you recruited additional housing targets using the same false emergency narrative you used on us." The methodical presentation of evidence was having the desired effect on our audience. Faces around the table were shifting from confusion to understanding to outrage, as family members realized they'd been witnessing an elaborate deception rather than a heartwarming story of intergenerational family support. Tyler, Kevin's younger brother, was the first to find his voice. "Mom, is this true? Did you really sell your house and lie about it?" Robert attempted to take control of the narrative with bluster and indignation. "This is outrageous. How dare you ambush us like this in front of our family? We've done nothing but try to help around here and show appreciation for your hospitality." "Appreciation," I repeated, savoring the word. "Like using my credit card this morning to buy groceries after I confronted you about unauthorized charges yesterday? That kind of appreciation?" I pulled out my phone and showed the real-time purchase notification that had appeared during our Christmas morning preparations. $73 at King Soopers at 9:47 this morning. Would you like to explain how that demonstrates appreciation rather than ongoing theft? The concrete evidence of continued criminal behavior, even after partial confrontation, eliminated any possibility that Robert and Diane could characterize their actions as misunderstandings or mistakes. The family members closest to them could see the notification on my phone screen, confirming that their theft was both deliberate and ongoing. Carla, Tyler's wife, spoke into the horrified silence. "Oh my God, Diane, you've been stealing from them this whole time?" "It's not stealing when you're family," Diane said desperately, grasping for any argument that might generate sympathy from her audience. "We've been contributing to the household, helping with maintenance, making improvements. We never took anything that wasn't shared freely." The word freely in the context of secret credit card charges was so absurd that several family members actually laughed, though the laughter had a shocked, nervous quality that indicated their discomfort with the entire situation. "Shared freely," I repeated, opening the folder of evidence to a page documenting her most expensive unauthorized purchases. "Like the $800 massage chair you bought with my credit card and had delivered to your bedroom? Or the $1,200 you spent on Christmas gifts for extended family members using my account information?" The Christmas gifts revelation hit the gathering like another explosion because several family members were wearing or using presents that had apparently been purchased with stolen money. Kevin's teenage niece was suddenly staring at her new designer handbag with horror, while his elderly uncle was examining the expensive bottle of wine he'd brought to share, as if it had transformed into evidence of criminal activity. Kevin finally found his voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. "Mom, how could you do this?" The betrayal in his voice was devastating to witness because it represented the complete collapse of his faith in parents he'd defended, enabled, and prioritized over his own marriage for months. The son who had argued that I was being vindictive toward confused elderly people was finally confronting the reality that his parents were sophisticated criminals who had manipulated his emotions to facilitate their theft. "Kevin, honey, you don't understand the pressure we've been under," Diane began, switching to the emotional manipulation tactics that had worked so effectively in private conversations. "We were desperate, scared about our financial future, and we didn't know how to ask for help without seeming like failures. So you decided to steal instead," Melissa said flatly, her voice carrying the disgust of someone realizing she'd been defending criminals at family gatherings for months. "You made us all complicit in fraud by letting us believe you were the victims of circumstances rather than the perpetrators of crimes." The family dynamics I was witnessing revealed how completely Robert and Diane had manipulated everyone's perceptions of the situation. Extended family members had been privately criticizing me for being insufficiently welcoming to elderly relatives facing housing emergencies, while praising Robert and Diane for their grace under pressure and grateful attitude toward family assistance. "We never meant for it to go this far," Robert said, his authoritative demeanor crumbling under the weight of exposed deception. "We thought we could pay everything back once we got our finances stabilized." "Stabilized with money stolen from other family members," I replied, pulling out the documentation I'd discovered about their previous fraud schemes. "Like the 6 months you spent with Diane's sister using the same false emergency story, until she discovered unauthorized charges on her credit cards and evicted you." The revelation that Robert and Diane had targeted multiple family members with identical schemes eliminated any remaining possibility that their behavior could be attributed to desperation or poor judgment under stress. The pattern of deliberate predatory behavior was now undeniable to everyone present. Kevin sank back into his chair, his head in his hands as the full scope of his parents' deception became clear. "Jesus Christ, what else don't I know?" "Probably quite a lot," I admitted with something approaching sympathy for my husband's position. As both victim and enabler of his parents' manipulation, they've been systematically lying to all of us for months, triangulating communication to prevent us from comparing notes and discovering inconsistencies in their stories. The psychological sophistication of Robert and Diane's deception was becoming apparent to family members who were now remembering conversations, inconsistencies, and red flags they'd dismissed or rationalized over the past several months. The manipulation hadn't been limited to Kevin and me. It had extended throughout their social network to create support systems and prevent accountability. "So, what happens now?" Tyler asked, his voice indicating he was afraid to hear the answer. I gestured toward the legal documents that Robert and Diane had finally opened and were reading with increasing horror. "They have 30 days to vacate my property. The criminal charges have been filed with the Denver Police Department Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Santos will be contacting them within 48 hours to schedule formal interviews." The mention of police involvement sent another shockwave through the gathering, as family members realized this situation had moved far beyond private family drama into actual criminal justice proceedings. The possibility that Robert and Diane could face prison sentences made the consequences real in a way that civil eviction alone wouldn't have achieved. "Prison?" Diane whispered, the word barely audible over the stunned silence. "Multiple felony charges typically result in prison sentences when defendants are convicted," I confirmed without emotion. "The systematic nature of your fraud and the involvement of vulnerable family members makes this a serious case that prosecutors will pursue aggressively." Kevin's cousin Sarah spoke for the first time since my announcement. "How long have you known about all this?" I discovered the credit card fraud 3 weeks ago, I replied honestly. The investigation into their actual circumstances took about 2 weeks of professional research using legal databases and public records. The criminal complaint was filed yesterday. The timeline revealed that I'd been conducting a comprehensive legal investigation while maintaining normal family interactions, attending holiday preparations, and allowing Diane to plan an elaborate Christmas dinner in my home. The calculated patience and strategic thinking required for such an approach was impressive to some family members and terrifying to others. "You've been planning this whole thing," Robert accused, apparently trying to shift blame for the situation onto my response rather than their criminal behavior. "You set us up." "I documented your crimes and pursued appropriate legal remedies," I corrected. "You set yourselves up by choosing to commit fraud, theft, and deception instead of honestly asking for help with your financial problems." The distinction between strategic documentation of ongoing criminal behavior and entrapment seemed lost on Robert. But several family members nodded in understanding of my position. The legal professional in me appreciated their recognition that victims of ongoing crimes have every right to protect themselves through whatever lawful means necessary. Melissa turned to her parents with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Why didn't you just ask for help? We're family. We would have figured something out if you'd been honest about your situation." The question highlighted the most tragic aspect of Robert and Diane's choices, because it was probably true that honest communication about their financial crisis might have generated family support without requiring criminal behavior. Their decision to use manipulation and theft instead of transparency and requests for assistance had created a situation where help was no longer possible. "We were embarrassed," Diane said through tears that might have been genuine remorse or might have been another manipulation tactic. "We didn't want anyone to know how badly we'd mismanaged our finances. We thought we could fix everything quietly without burdening anyone else with our problems. So, you decided to burden us with criminal behavior instead," Kevin said, his voice growing stronger as anger replaced shock. "You made me complicit in fraud by lying to my wife. You made me choose between my marriage and defending people I thought were victims when you were actually criminals." The impact on Kevin's relationship with his parents was perhaps the most devastating consequence of their deception because it represented the destruction of fundamental trust between family members. Even if they somehow avoided prison sentences, the knowledge of their manipulative behavior would permanently alter every future interaction. "Kevin, please." Robert attempted one final appeal to family loyalty. "We're still your parents. We made mistakes, but we love you. Don't let this destroy our family." "You destroyed our family when you chose to commit crimes instead of asking for help," Kevin replied with a finality that surprised everyone, including me. "You destroyed it when you lied to me for months and made me an accomplice to defrauding my own wife." The transformation in Kevin's perspective was remarkable to witness because it represented his complete rejection of the emotional manipulation tactics that had controlled his behavior for months. The son who had prioritized his parents' comfort over his wife's legitimate rights was finally choosing appropriate boundaries over enabling criminal behavior. The dinner guests began leaving shortly after this exchange, the holiday celebration, irreparably destroyed by revelations that would require weeks or months for family members to fully process. Children were hustled toward coat closets by parents who were eager to escape the toxic atmosphere, while elderly relatives shook their heads in bewilderment at behavior they couldn't comprehend from people they'd known for decades. Robert and Diane retreated to their room, presumably to discuss their limited options for responding to criminal charges and eviction proceedings. The legal documents I'd served made clear that their choices were essentially limited to voluntary departure within 30 days or forced removal through court proceedings that would create additional legal complications. Kevin and I were left alone in my dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what had been planned as a joyous family celebration, but had instead become the most dramatic confrontation in Walsh family history. The elaborate table settings and festive decorations created a surreal backdrop for the conversation we needed to have about our marriage's future. "I'm sorry," Kevin said quietly, his voice carrying genuine remorse that I hadn't heard in months of arguments about his parents. "I should have supported you from the beginning. I should have seen what they were doing." The apology was meaningful, because it represented acknowledgement of choices he'd made rather than circumstances that had happened to him. Kevin was finally taking responsibility for prioritizing his parents' manipulation over his wife's legitimate needs and concerns. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, feeling something approaching relief for the first time in months. "But we need to talk about whether sorry is enough to rebuild what's been damaged." The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight and covered months of accumulated resentment, broken trust, and fundamental disagreements about family loyalty versus appropriate boundaries. Kevin's willingness to finally confront his parents' criminal behavior was encouraging, but it didn't automatically resolve the underlying issues that had made their manipulation possible. The 30 days that followed were challenging, but ultimately transformative for our marriage. Robert and Diane departed on schedule, apparently choosing voluntary relocation over criminal prosecution negotiations. They moved to Arizona, where Diane's remaining sister agreed to provide temporary housing, with strict supervision and financial oversight. The criminal charges were reduced to misdemeanors in exchange for full restitution and agreement to avoid contact with previous victims, an outcome that satisfied my goals of recovering stolen money and preventing future fraud without requiring lengthy court proceedings. Kevin entered individual therapy to address the psychological manipulation he'd experienced and develop healthier boundaries with family members who exhibited problematic behavior. Our marriage counseling sessions were productive because both of us were finally committed to honest communication rather than conflict avoidance. 6 months later, my home felt like my own space again. The guest bedroom had been converted into a proper home office with a new ergonomic chair. The living room had been restored to my preferred minimalist aesthetic, and the kitchen operated according to routines that Kevin and I established together rather than accommodating external demands. The Walsh family dynamics required significant adjustment as extended family members processed the revelation that respected elderly relatives had been career criminals who manipulated family loyalty to facilitate theft. Some relationships were permanently damaged, while others grew stronger through shared commitment to honesty and appropriate boundaries. Kevin's relationship with his parents remained strained, but gradually improved as they demonstrated genuine behavior changes rather than continued manipulation attempts. The geographic distance and supervised living arrangement prevented them from creating new opportunities for problematic behavior, while allowing limited contact that satisfied Kevin's need for family connection. Looking back on that Christmas dinner confrontation, I realized it represented more than just the resolution of a specific housing and fraud situation. It was the moment when I reclaimed not just my home, but my right to establish and enforce boundaries that protected my well-being and financial security. The legal skills that had served my clients so effectively in property disputes and tenant conflicts had ultimately been necessary to protect my own interests against people who viewed family relationships as opportunities for exploitation rather than sources of mutual support and respect. Sometimes the most important battles we fight are the ones that teach us our own worth and establish the standards we'll accept in our most intimate relationships. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to showcase Diane's hosting abilities instead became my declaration of independence from people who had forgotten that generosity requires gratitude and family loyalty requires honesty. The red ribbon I'd tied around that eviction notice had been more prophetic than I'd realized at the time. It wasn't just gift wrapping for legal documents, it was the bow on a package containing my self-respect, my financial security, and my refusal to be diminished by people who mistook kindness for weakness. In the end, the best gift I gave myself that Christmas was the recognition that some relationships are worth fighting for, while others are worth fighting against. The difference lies in whether the people involved are committed to mutual respect or simply seeking opportunities for personal advantage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.